We think of the creative economy as that part of the economy which makes use of creativity and creative work for commercial purposes. If you look at the economic statistics in countries like the UK, we find that the creative economy in recent years has been growing 2-3 times faster than the rest of the economy. And in a recent research report, we've also we've also learnt that the EU, the European economy, has a very fast-growing creative economy. So if you think about what creative work is, creative work involves deploying cognitive skills, analytical skills to bring about novelty, product differentiation, new ways of thinking and doing things in a way that cannot be anticipated fully in advance. So the quintessential idea of creative work is that it's conducive to innovation. It gives rise to innovation and hence growth. So we believe that the creative element of the workforce is more important for long-term economic growth. So we undertook a study using UK labour force survey data last year, which suggested that in general, creative occupations were associated with higher levels of happiness, with a feeling that people's lives were worthwhile, and with higher levels of life satisfaction than other jobs. But of course, well-being is explained by lots of other factors. For example, income, how much you're earning. If you control for those other aspects, those other determinants of well-being, what you find is that artistic and design-oriented occupations have higher levels of well-being than other occupations, but in other elements of the creative workforce, areas in IT-related occupations, advertising, well-being appears to be actually lower. So I think the first thing to say is that cultural policy should be mainly designed and implemented for cultural reasons. That said, it is undeniably the fact that countries which have very healthy and vibrant cultural sectors also tend to have vibrant, economically successful commercial creative industries. So from the point of view of policymakers, they should try and understand the relationship between the cultural sector and the commercial creative industries, and then there are these linkages, or what are sometimes described as spillovers from the cultural sector to the creative industries. These should be supported and maximised. So I think the additional thing I would say is, what do we mean by culture? If one looks at the way that cultural policy is actually implemented in different countries in Europe, they're remarkably conservative in what the definition of art and culture actually is, the scope of art and culture. And yet what we know is that culture on the ground in reality is very, very dynamic. There are new forms of art and culture arising all the time, new forms of cultural participants and cultural participation. And yet policy sometimes seems to be behind the curve. So one of the things I think governments generally need to do is to prove their understandings of culture as it's happening on the ground, and then ensure that the way that they support culture through cultural policy instruments is more fit for purpose. So we published a research report in Nesta recently which suggested that businesses that deployed both artistic and design skills as well as science and technology skills in the workforce, other things being equal, grew faster and were more innovative than businesses that just focused on science and technology skills in the workforce. So there seems to be some pretty strong evidence, economic evidence, that there are economic returns to be had for a country from investing in a more broad-based sort of skills make up for its workforce. The implication for the education system, of course, is that we should be very careful to avoid inadvertently introducing barriers to this multidisciplinary education. Sometimes there tends to be, there are incentives for younger people to specialise in either science or technology or the arts and humanities at a young age. This sort of research suggests that education policy makers need to be mindful that they are not inadvertently discouraging the type of broad-based education which it appears is valued in the workplace. I think the first thing government should do is to recognise that some of the disciplinary silos that have been created for example in schools, is partly a reflection of what government itself has done, the way they have structured curricula, the way they have identified or valued technical and specialised skills that teachers have to teach their own subjects. They should look at the curriculum, for example. They should look at the way that school environments are structured to enable the more multidisciplinary education that we're talking about. So all the evidence suggests, and in the UK we've been conducting a longitudinal survey now for 3 years on how arts and cultural institutions use technology in their work, and all the evidence suggests that there is a high level of awareness amongst art and cultural organisations of some of the opportunities from technology. I think it's fair to say though that to date what we've seen is largely incremental innovations, ways in which technology, for example, can be used by theatres and performing arts companies to break out of the physical constraints that are usually imposed by having a venue and using digital technology to broadcast live their or stream their performances to wider audiences. We've seen those sorts of incremental innovations. Perhaps what we've not yet seen is the type of radical innovation, for example, that we've seen brought about by technology in the case of music. If you think about the music industry, the way we engage with music experiences, it's a far cry from 10-15 years ago where we were relying on physical recorded devices like compact discs, albums. These days within seconds one can access or have new musical experiences through streaming services. That sort of radical innovation which is changing the very nature of the cultural experience, I don't think we've seen widely in the arts and cultural sector. But my prediction is that in years to come we will see more of these more radical, disruptive innovations in the arts and culture. Yeah, I mean, I think it's the prima facie evidence that arts and cultural institutions can contribute to social outcomes is if you look at the missions of many of these organisations. I mean, often they are instituted as charities with charitable objects and charitable missions, and those missions are often about as well as cultural improving the cultural well-being of the public, but also achieving social outcomes. So I think it's undeniably the case that some of the outcomes that we see from arts and cultural organisations in terms of well-being are manifested in social well-being and social outcomes, in terms of learning and education outcomes for young people, in terms of social inclusion, when communities that are perhaps have been previously disengaged from culture through the work of an individual theatre company, for example, are more engaged with culture. Well, I think the thing is, art and culture, although there are many, many examples of institutions that are doing great work and achieving positive social outcomes through their work with local communities, we should also recognise that art and culture can sometimes be the instrument of social exclusion, and that it can be used as a way of communities building creating barriers to engagement, and I think it's very important that policymakers are aware of that potential outcome as well. So the most obvious way in which economics contributes to our understanding of art and culture is by recognition of the fact that, like every other activity, art and culture happens within economic constraints. Artists work within economic constraints. They need, at a most obvious basic level, they need their time and financial resources to undertake their activity. So there is a very direct sense in which economics can contribute to our understanding of arts and culture, in the same way it contributes to our understanding of all activity which has an economic dimension. At the same time, economics provides, we have hundreds of years of quite a developed theory of value, which can be applied to art and culture as it can in other areas. This is a utilitarian theory of value. It's a particular conception of value, and it should not be privileged over competing and alternative approaches to value. But as a part of a multidisciplinary understanding of what art and culture is, economists can also contribute their particular approach and conception of what value is. Well, one of the points that the keynote speaker Andy Pratt, Professor Andy Pratt, made at the conference this morning was that in the past the lack of good data and lack of opportunities for good empirical work in the art and cultural sector was one of the reasons why there were not more economists working in the art and cultural sector. Well, one of the benefits of the so-called big data revolution associated with the internet and ICTs more generally is there are vast amounts of more data that are now available in principle to researchers to understand the phenomenon of art and culture. So I think one of the things that we are going to see in coming years is far more empirical work, far more data work to understand those aspects of art and cultural activity which up until now have been hidden from the eyes of researchers. I think it's partly to do with the fact that culture is very fast changing and dynamic, which makes it difficult for traditional ways that researchers use to try and understand the world, like surveys and censuses and registries. It makes it difficult for those data sources to catch up. So it's partly about it being fast changing, but it's also because of the fact that culture is increasingly mediated digitally. And what that means is culture itself is leaving a digital footprint in a way it wasn't before. And one of the aspects, of course, of the digital revolution is that it leaves a data footprint which allows analysts to access that data and try and use it to understand, improve their understanding of art and culture. I mean, a good example of this is social media data. We know that a lot of discussions and attitudes and perceptions and reactions to cultural experiences are now being mediated online through social media platforms. This creates opportunities for researchers and analysts like myself to access that data, clean that data, make it fit for purpose for research analysis, and then hopefully to use that to improve our understanding about art and culture as it is today. That's a very big question, and I think the answer varies depending on what type of research domain you're talking about. I think in the art and culture area, which is obviously the subject of the conference, the ACI conference here today, I think partly there's a problem that there are insufficient number of academics who are addressing research questions that policymakers need answers to today. That's not to say that there isn't some relevant, obviously policy relevant research that's being conducted, but I do think that there is there could be some useful reprioritizing of research priorities towards the sorts of questions that policymakers need answers for. So that's one comment I'd make. I think the other thing I'd say, which is maybe a feature of all research, all academic research, not just particular to art and culture, is that the horizons that policymakers often work to are shorter than the horizons that academic researchers work to. And what that means is that, for example, whereas it may take a couple of years, for example, for a monograph or an academic book or volume to be put together, designed and published, the research questions that those researchers were addressing in that volume that policymakers were focused on at that time, well, they may have sort of become less of less contemporary interest to policymakers. Policymakers have moved on. So I think there is a sense in which there's a bit of a disconnect between the horizons of policymakers, which are shorter, and academics, which are longer. And there's no easy answer to that, but I do believe that the academy can do more to ensure that policy-relevant research insights are codified and made more available and put in languages that policymakers can act on more quickly than they currently can.